All right. Since it is noon, I think we do want to dive in. Thank you again to everyone who is joining us today. This is a webinar presented by the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, which is part of a quarterly series that we do. And the HTPP is a project that is a partnership between University of Baltimore School of Law and Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service. My name is Heather Heiman. I'm an attorney at MVLS, and I'm the project manager for the HTPP and for the pro bono arm of the project. And I'm here today with the director of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, Jessica Emerson.
Hi, everyone.
And we are very honored today and excited to have our guest presenter, Kate D'Adamo, who will be giving us some really valuable information today and hopefully sparking some great discussions with some recent research and data that she's going to share. Before I dive into her full introduction, I just wanted to note that we are recording this webinar and it will be posted on our website, which is www.mvlslaw.org/HT. And you can find it there as along with all of the other presentations and webinars that we have given during the course of this project. So again, I had asked people to introduce themselves in the chat. Thank you so much for all of you that are doing that. It's nice for us to know who's gathered here today. We will be using the chat later once Kate has had a chance to give her presentation. And while she is giving her presentation, we are going to be monitoring the Q&A and answering questions throughout it. But first, before we dive in, I do want to give Kate a proper introduction. Thank you so much for being here. Kate is a longtime sex worker rights activist with a focus on economic justice, anti-policing, incarceration, and public health. She is a consultant and partner with Reframe Health and Justice. Prior to that, she was the national policy advocate at the Sex Worker Project at the Urban Justice Center, focusing on laws, policies, and advocacy that focused on people who trade sex, including the criminalization of sex work, anti-trafficking policies, and HIV-specific laws. Prior to joining that project, Kate was a community organizer and advocate with the Sex Worker Outreach Project and Sex Workers Action in New York. In this role, she developed programming to promote community building, provide peer support, and advance political advocacy to support the rights and well-beings of people engaged in the sex trade, both on and off the job. And she has degrees from California Polytechnic State University and the New School. And we could not be more honored to have her here today and to again lead us in what is sometimes, a very challenging discussion. So thank you, Kate.
Thank you both so much for having me, and thank you to everyone for being here. An hour and a half is a lot of time to spend in all of the work you guys do. So I deeply appreciate it. And I have a lot of gratitude. So yeah, we're going to be talking about decriminalization of sex work, but we're really going to be talking about different legal approaches that have been tried across the globe and really looking at the dynamics that creates and the outcomes and the impacts that has. So we're going to just be talking about ways that different countries regulate the sex trade and kind of seeing what's happened afterwards. We're trying to figure out what is out there. There's a lot of data and trying to make sure that when we're engaging in policy conversations, they're really evidence-based. So just for today, we're going to start with just a quick amount of housekeeping. Then we're going to talk about just what those different regulatory frameworks are, and then look at the impacts that these changes have had, and then hopefully have some discussion. You guys know more than I could ever guess that you would want to know, and you have so much insight on this subject that I think having these conversations is really important in being able to share this information, but also talk about how it resonates with what we've seen on the ground.
Great.
So first, I'm sorry. Go for it.
So before we start with kind of these conversational agreements, I wanted to just say a few words before Kate begins. We know that the issue of decriminalization evokes a lot of passionate responses from people who work in the anti-trafficking field. This webinar is not being held with the intent of convincing anyone that decriminalization of sex work is the right or wrong answer, quote unquote. Instead, what it really is an opportunity for those within the anti-trafficking field to listen, to really listen to information on legitimate global data on the various legal methods of regulating sex work. And we also recognize that because people feel so passionately about this issue, that just the decision that we made to present this webinar may have drawn a bit of ire from some of you who have tuned in. So what I'd really like for each one of you to do is to assume that we are all likely operating from a similar starting point, which is that we want people who trade sex, regardless of the reason for doing so, to be able to do so safely. That we want people who seek to exit the sex trade to be able to do so without the collateral consequences of criminal legal involvement holding them back. And that we all want to support a legal framework that does not increase trafficking or the numerous harms that trafficking victims already face. And I think if we can just as a group all agree to at least begin at this point, I think you'll find Kate's presentation really informative and really challenging. And so that being said, I want to encourage everyone to do just two things as you listen to this conversation. First, I want to encourage you to really sit with any material that challenges what you may have heard or believe without just immediately tossing it aside. Those of you who know me, you know that I talk about this all the time, that we know all too well as an anti-trafficking community that far too much of what we have and unfortunately continue to refer to as quote unquote data on the crime of human trafficking is really anything but. And unfortunately, the debate around decriminalization comes with those same struggles. Honestly, we can disagree about process, we can disagree about outcomes, but we can't do any of those things effectively if we don't have accurate data. The second thing I want to encourage you to consider is the impact of the various legal frameworks that Kate's going to present, not just on trafficking survivors, but on people who trade sex as a whole, particularly individuals who exist at the intersections of multiple types of oppression, like street-based sex workers, people who use drugs, trans people. The reality is that we are simply not affecting justice when we support policies or strategies that prioritize one group at the expense of the health and safety of other marginalized groups. So that's kind of just the framework that I want to encourage folks to consider as we go forward. And then Kate is going to get into the additional housekeeping. So thanks and welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I come from, I started in a sex worker rights background, and I've worked with people across the spectrum of experience. But I've worked in anti-trafficking spaces, specifically for folks that trade sex who are victims of trafficking. And I've worked in service provision trafficking spaces, which served all victims of trafficking in any sector. And so, yeah, I know exactly how heated and how difficult this conversation is. And I hope that you know, we can frame it in a way and we can craft a space to talk about some of the information that's out there. And, you know, I will always be a community organizer at heart. And so I love community agreements. I love icebreakers too, but I know there's a lot of people here and asking your favorite chair might not be a great way to use time. But here's some just places I like to start with, which first and foremost, speak from the I. No one speaks for everyone. We already know the problems with saying I am a voice for the voiceless usually means we're silencing people. And so we can only speak from our own experience, myself included. We commit to collective learning by challenging ourselves and challenging each other. We call each other in. We consider the space that we take up and the space that we leave for others, especially now that we've all switched to Zooms. The chat can be really, really difficult. And so if you, like myself, are very long-winded, just check in about literally the physical space that's being taken up in the chat, and you know, check in about whether or not space is being left for people to catch up or people to insert their thoughts into the conversation. Respect the diversity of our identities. In these spaces, we're constantly navigating how we show up, how we're perceived. People show up as service providers, as survivors, as organizers, as advocates, as lawyers, and they may say, I am not comfortable sharing all of my identities, but I am comfortable showing up in this way, and that safety is important. And so we honor that here by not making assumptions. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. We prioritize care for ourselves and each other. This is 90 minutes. No one's going to be offended if you go take a bathroom break. Take care of yourself. And that includes if something comes up for you and something is upsetting, know that we honor if staying on this is not for you, or if hopping off is better and coming back. We practice not using ableist language, both physical and mental, checking in about the language that we're using about something being crazy, people being clean. A lot of that language is really ableist, and we're going to try to avoid it by saying, you know, this doesn't correspond to my experience, or this person was having a different experience of reality, or this person is a substance user or not a substance user. I like an oops, ouch model, which is very similar to, we can't say things perfectly all the time, but we're going to try our best, which is also similar to operate in the yellow. Sometimes we're going to say something and it's not going to land right. And I encourage folks to identify that and invite the person who said it to rephrase the question in a way that honors that we all have good intentions to come here to learn. So the information that I'm going to share with you is about different legal approaches to the sex trade and to regulation of the sex trade. This comes from, I did a landscape scan starting about 2 years ago, where I looked at generally every single report I could find out of several different countries that have changed their regulatory model in about the last 22 years. The reports generally come from NGOs, some come from governmental departments, some of those countries had the Department of Justice or Department of Health do a study. And I only included studies that actually spoke to impacted people on the ground. There's a lot of economic modeling that's happened that stands in for impact research. And so every single report that I looked at, and I tried to, you know, be as expansive as possible, really looked at people who were trading sex before and after, and talked about the impact of that, as well as NGOs and service providers who were working before and after the law to compare what changes have been made. Some countries are more sparse than others, but that is where this information is coming from. And so we're going to be talking about a little bit about criminalization, which is the dominant global approach. And most importantly, every single state in the United States outside of Nevada, which operates as a legalization model, uses criminalization. Specifically, Maryland is a fully criminalized state. I looked at asymmetrical criminalization reports, also known as the Nordic model, also known as the equality model, also known as end demand, specifically from Sweden, Norway, France, Canada, and Northern Ireland. The two countries which have also adopted that model in the last 22 years are Iceland and Israel. Iceland never implemented the law. Israel only changed about 1.5 years ago, and so there just isn't information yet in any kind of robust way to be included. But 7 countries have changed. 5 of them are included in this discussion. I'm not going to talk about legalization much, and I will talk about why, but legalization is the model that's discussed in Germany and the Netherlands. And then decriminalization only exists right now in the country of New Zealand and the province of New South Wales in Australia. But the information pulled is specifically from New Zealand because they had a really robust, it's about 250 pages if you want to read it, a study that was from their Department of Justice that came out 5 years after the law. So that's where this information is coming from. More than happy to send you a very long bibliography if you want. So first and foremost, what are the approaches that we're talking about? And what we're talking about today, as I mentioned, there are really 4 different things 4 different ways to approach it. We're going to talk about a couple. So first and foremost, full criminalization, which is what we have here in Maryland, is where every single aspect of the sex trade faces criminalization. So people selling sex are criminalized, face criminal penalty. People buying sexual services face criminal penalty. Peers, so people facilitating, people receiving the proceeds of, and managers who may also be peers are also criminalized. So everyone kind of around who's making that experience possible also faces criminal penalty, and also locations and people who run and facilitate locations. So these are known as like brothel keeping laws, are also criminalized. And so that is generally like receiving money and knowing that you're renting a space to be used to be engaged in commercial sex. So the example is most of the United States. Asymmetrical criminalization is what I'm going to be talking about. That's the Nordic model, that's the end-demand model. And that is a model where sellers are not going to necessarily face criminal penalties for engaging in criminal sex, but everyone else remains criminalized. A lot of times it's talked about as purchasers, but there's no model in the world where it's third parties are not also criminalized. And so while that transaction is really what we're going to be talking about, peers, managers, and locations are also generally facing criminal penalty. And the 5 countries I mentioned, Canada being the best example because it is the most similar, both in its historical trajectory about how it got to criminalization as applied to the United States, but also it's pretty close. And it has a lot of really robust information about it. So Canada is probably the best place. If you're looking for more data, Canada is the place where I would begin my research because there has been so much robust research. And finally, decriminalization, where the exchange of sex is not something that faces criminal penalty. Trafficking, violence, patronizing of minors all remain criminalized activities. And there is, before there is this question, there is regulation of the sex trade. It's just regulated similar to other forms of intimate labor. And so the law that actually decriminalized in New Zealand includes about 55 pages of industry-based regulations.
Kate, I just want to, if you can go back to
what
that
about legalization?
Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Kate, can you, yeah, I just want to kind of highlight one thing. I talked in my intro about how we just, when we feel passionate about things, sometimes our data can be a little bit questionable because we want to prove how we feel, and that's very understandable. One of the things that I hear most often from folks who talk about decrim is that in addition to decriminalizing the interaction of buying and selling sex, trafficking and violence against people who sell sex is also decriminalized. And so I just want to kind of highlight, in terms of your research, that is not the case with regard to decriminalization, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And actually in the decriminalization law in New Zealand, it actually added the penalty for patronizing a minor because it wouldn't have existed if they had just decriminalized. So they actually created that penalty. So our version of trafficking was actually created in the decriminalization law because it wouldn't have been otherwise. So why are we not talking about legalization? And happy to, if you want to, let's do it. So legalization is a type of approach where it's legalized, as it said. There is generally incredibly high government-based regulation of the industry, which looks different in every single country. So the overarching umbrella description is that there's a huge amount of government-based regulation of the sex industry that's incredibly unique to the sex industry. And also it narrows a lot both who can participate and the ways that you can participate. It also, one of the other reasons why I'm not going to be talking about legalization a lot is because no one's pushing it. No one wants it. There's really no legalization advocates in the United States at this point. And generally what you're looking at is in about the 70s through the 90s, a lot of places instituted legalization because what they did was create regulatory models that were based a lot on kind of what was already happening that they wanted to codify in law. So that's why you see it in like a specific set of European countries. It happened all around the same 10, 15 years. And each country is going to look a little bit different because it was really based on what was already happening. So in these places, so as someone said, in Nevada, it's only legalized in specific counties. In 11 counties is what we're talking about in Nevada. You have to work, for example, you have to register, you have to work for a brothel. There's mandatory health checks and screening that have to be done through the government. And operating outside of that still faces criminal penalties, which are actually higher than Maryland's. And Nevada is actually the highest arrest state in the entire country. And by epic proportions. When you look at the data about how many people, about arrest records, you're looking, if you break them down by state per capita, Florida and California are usually duking it out for 2 and 3. Nevada is 10 times higher than both of those states when you look at per capita arrest rates. And so this is not a form of decriminalization, and no one's really advocating for it. And if you want to look at kind of what some of those regulations are, Germany's a great example because it has not only had those regulations, it codified what was already happening, but in 2017, it really clarified what the regulations were. So as far as I know, of the countries that are that engage in legalization, Germany is probably the best example of what that is because they so recently had a very clear clarification of the law. And so when did these changes occur? So we're really talking about the last 22 years. Sweden was the first to implement this model in 1999. And to give a little bit of additional perspective, so Sweden codified this in 1999 and about 3 years later actually instituted their trafficking law. And the Palermo Protocols, which are the international trafficking regulations, and the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2000. So this was all kind of happening right around the same moment. This should tell you also a little bit about how robust the data is going to be for any of these countries, especially when we're talking about the dynamics of trafficking. We know that there were not that many trafficking prosecutions, even for folks that wanted to in like 2000, 2001, because no prosecutor really knew what they were doing. And so it gets a little tricky when we're looking for really specific numbers at that point, especially because you also have to think about how much work was happening to really understand what was facing people in the sex industry around this time, and how much was changing in terms of the dynamics of the sex industry at this time. For just kind of some additional context, about 2000 to 2007 was when people were getting cell phones, when the internet was happening, when different advertising sites happened. So this is also a period where you're seeing an incredible amount of changes happening just in terms of how people were trading sex. So Sweden was the first to codify this, and a couple years later, New Zealand in 2003 decriminalized their sex industry. So there are two kind of interesting pieces. And then a little bit later, Norway moved to asymmetrical criminalization, followed by Canada. Canada was predicated on a lawsuit, actually, which removed the criminalization of sex work because it was in violation of their constitution's provision about access to health and safety. Northern Ireland and France in 2016 switched to asymmetrical criminalization statutes. And then Iceland, I think was similar to Norway right around the same time, but like I said, never implemented. And Israel was, I believe, 2018. And so because, we have these different models that in the last 20 years have shifted, we actually have a lot of data about what this did. And especially now that we have several countries to draw from for asymmetrical criminalization, we have a lot of information. I'm also someone where I am super transparent about the places where there is data and the places where there isn't. Having a sample set of New Zealand, if we learned anything from the pandemic, it's that New Zealand is amazing and does things that are phenomenal. And so having a data set that is grounded in a single country as much as I love New Zealand, also the context of having robust social support and socialized medicine does have an impact on this. So I'll be really transparent that we can pull from New Zealand and also recognize that the information that's available on decriminalization is a smaller sample set that's grounded in a place that was really rooted in a different context than a lot of the folks that we're going to be facing here. So I'm happy to talk about but that said, we know the impact of criminalization. We know the impact of changing policing practices. We know what happened and didn't happen in the sample sets that we do have of decriminalization. And so that's really where this discussion is kind of coming from. So there's a lot of different things that you can look at as far as the impact of, what this did to the sex trade. And one of the things that I hear all the time is this idea that criminalization of the sex trade has a huge impact on the size of the sex trade. And, I think that goes into a lot of the language around supply and demand. The thing is, people that trade sex are not widgets and they're not gadgets. And so one of the things that was found was that when asymmetrical criminalization came in, where it went from it was not illegal to buy or sell sex, or it was illegal to sell and legal to buy, when it went to criminalization of clients, countries did not experience a change in the size of the sex trade. So there wasn't additional demand, but there also wasn't reduced demand. There were no fewer clients seeking sex. They just kind of shifted to seek sex in different ways. Out of the 5 countries, Norway is the only one which saw a reduction in the number of people selling sex. And that's because Norway in particular, and they're pretty open about this, you can read all about it, it was called Operation Homelessness. And what Norwegian police departments did was they specifically said, we're targeting migrant sex workers, because migrant sex workers are still criminalized under asymmetrical criminalization and under decriminalization in New Zealand. And so Norwegian police said, because of just the dynamics and the racial dynamics of the country, that they were targeting racialized sex workers, profiling them as migrants, and engage in a practice of forced eviction by identifying people that they thought were sex workers, were racialized sex workers, sending letters to their landlords and saying, you're going to be prosecuted if you don't evict this person. And so you can read a lot about it. Amnesty International has an incredible report about Operation Homeless. But that was the reason why Norway saw a 10% decrease in the size of their sex industry, was because of those operations. There was a change in the dynamics under which people traded sex, which is kind of the consistent thing that you're going to see. And especially in Sweden, a lot of people went online. It happened in 1999. A lot of people got cell phones. A lot of people found the internet. And a lot of people utilized the increase in policing to have that as a catalyst to move to indoor spaces from street-based spaces. But overall, there's no country that's been able to really say that this particular implementation of the law has changed, either expanded or reduced the size of their sex trade. When sex work was decriminalized in New Zealand, yes.
A quick question. So with what happened in Norway, and the way that different groups were targeted, was that based on citizenship status, or was there some bright line in the law? Or I'm just curious how that looked.
Sure. So Norway in the 2000s also saw a lot of dynamics really shifting as far as what their immigration patterns were looking like. Specifically, a huge amount of influx from Nigeria and from Thailand. Also, you're talking about the time that the EU is forming and reducing their barriers to crossing country lines once they get in. And so especially Nordic countries and Northern European countries were really upset about that, quite frankly, because of the influx of immigrants that were coming up through Italy. And so there was, and the Norwegian police are pretty straightforward about it. Under these models, you can sell sex, but only if you're a citizen of the country. And so there was an assumption that if you were a sex worker and you were racialized, specifically Thai or Nigerian, they assumed that you were not a citizen. And so based on that, that's how their profiling went, really specifically to say, we are still tracking sex workers who are engaging in criminalized activity. It's just that we are using race as a proxy for criminalization.
Thank you for clarifying. It's interesting that that distinction was drawn, and seeing that incredible and harmful impact that it had.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things is displacement isn't the same as exiting the trade, and losing track of people is not the same as saying that they've gone to something more productive. So under decriminalization, the reason why people sell sex and the reason why people buy sex is often not because it's legal or illegal. It changes the dynamics, but for people who really want to who really need to sell sex, they still need to under criminalization schemes. For people who don't want to do it, it is it is a stigmatized form of physical labor that has really erratic hours. And so if criminalization is the massive barrier, a lot of people are just not going to trade sex. And so changing those dynamics is often not really a meaningful distinction for folks. Under decriminalization in New Zealand, there was no meaningful change. There was a slight decline at first around the numbers, but it was not necessarily statistically significant before and after. There was movement, once again, from street-based and third-party controlled. So for people who were doing street-based work and wanted a manager of some kind, probably to offer, to offer protection, they moved to brothel-based spaces because you still get the same management, you still get similar, a person facilitating, you still, and so it was similar enough to where people who were in that position more likely were moving into brothel-based work, but there was no overall change in the size of the industry. The impact of criminalization. And so, or I guess this probably should be kind of the impact of criminalization and policing a little bit. So under asymmetrical criminalization, sex workers actually continued to face criminal penalties through either third-party laws or through other laws. And there actually is a study that just came out in, I think, the last month or two out of Chicago, which says it's, you know, the leader in end-demand policing, that it only focuses on buyers. And it found really similar results, that because policing either increased or stayed, the dynamics of policing stayed the same, sex workers were often just charged with other things. And so in other countries, you were looking at sex workers generally charged with third-party laws when they were working together, or other things like possession, trespassing, carrying a weapon, open warrants, that kind of stuff, which, you know, a lot of the folks that we work with have a lot of charges on their record. I know from working in New York, when we were talking about youth, it was all diversion for prostitution charges. And one of the things that we found was that for female identified and female presenting minors who were charged with prostitution, 50% of them had another charge on their record, regardless of how long they've been trading sex. And for male identified, it was closer to 80 or 90 had another charge on their record. And so people were still interacting with police and people were still copping charges. It was just a different charge.
You know, Kate, this is
under decriminalization.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if it's a lag on my end or what it is. I apologize. You know, this is, you know, when we talk.
Oh, I just talk a lot and real fast.
When we talk about the difference between decriminalization and asymmetrical criminalization, or the equality model, the thing that always kind of puzzled me logically about asymmetrical criminalization was how we could have two parts of a criminalized interaction and assume that one party is going to get out of the interaction without criminalization, even though the entire, you know, the transaction itself is still illegal. And kind of in talking through this material with you, you kind of helped me do a shift, not necessarily in the, you know, decriminalization versus non-decriminalization, but it's about policing practices. And when policing practices don't change, then the interaction between people involved in a criminalized transaction doesn't change. And I think it tends to be my challenge with programs like LEAD, for instance, right? So pre-arrest diversion. It sounds wonderful and I support it in theory, but when you're talking about the challenges that people face who interact with police, especially those who are at high risk of being victims of discrimination and sexual violence and physical violence, like people who trade sex are, you know, that doesn't magically go away because we've made a switch from full decriminalization to asymmetrical decriminalization, or full, you know, or post-arrest diversion to pre-arrest diversion. And, you know, when at the heart of it, and this has just been really helpful for me to wrap my brain around kind of some of my logic concerns, we're talking about policing practices not changing. And like you said, I can tell you for sure that the clients I've worked with over the span of nearly 20 years of doing this work, you know, they arrive at the transaction, you know, holding substances or holding a weapon for their protection, or with a violation of probation, an outstanding warrant. And so the assumption that if you decriminalize the sale of sex, so if I sell sex, that piece of what I'm doing is not going to get me locked up. There are plenty of other things to get me locked up. And so when we consider that our concern is safety and criminalization, that has always been my challenge with asymmetrical criminalization, exactly because of what you're talking about. Policing practices are not changing, even though the law is. Sorry,
Absolutely.
just a
and
note.
I think, you know, no. And we're definitely going to dive into policing and kind of what that impact has. But yeah, you know, If you have ever worked with a trafficking survivor that only had prostitution charges on their record, congratulations. Because I think anyone who's worked, especially in vacatur, knows like having to explain the weapons charge is really hard. And so so those practices really still happen under this. And the Chicago study showed that after saying, you know, we only are policing buyers, we are doing this, post-implementation, 80% of charges, they reduced the number of people who are being convicted under prostitution charges. 80% of them remained sellers of sexual services. And under decriminalization, again, New Zealand was tricky. Criminalization was still impacting migrant sex workers. Migrant sex workers were not included in the decriminalization law in New Zealand. The government has said that they are revisiting that because they recognize that that was a mistake. And so criminalization was still impacting migrant sex workers who were still facing potential deportation under the law. But because the dynamics of policing were consistent before and afterwards, and significantly lower than what we experience in other countries. That was kind of the only thing that was reported in terms of who was still facing criminalization, and it was really migrants. Impact on working conditions. So Canada, this one was tricky because Canada in particular was the only one who really called them explicitly working conditions. So if the boundaries of working conditions seem nebulous, it's because they are. Violence when you trade sex is a working condition. But in Canada, they really clearly said, when they described it this way, 72% of workers said they saw no change. 26% reported a deterioration in their in the conditions. So 3% of workers in Canada saw an improvement after the law. And when they described what the impact on working conditions was, it was the inability to screen clients, reduced prices and more competition because it was harder to identify clients, and then working in isolated locations. Jess kind of touched on it already. And we're going to talk more. I feel like it's the thread throughout. Criminalization does not change. Removal of criminal penalties does not remove policing. And it is the dynamics of policing which inform how you engage in criminalized activity. So if you are engaged in criminalized activity like jaywalking in Baltimore City, there's not a lot of policing for it. And even it is criminalized. You still can face a penalty for jaywalking in Baltimore City. No one is going to care. Therefore, you're going to jaywalk. You're going to have no problem. I was driving home from the gym today. People jaywalk. They love jaywalking. And so that's because even though it's a criminalized activity, Jess is a perpetrator. Just because it's a criminalized activity, the practices of policing are informing people's behavior about how and where they're going to participate. If you go to Las Vegas, Nevada, they love to cite people for jaywalking because just the density of people, the way that city works, the infrastructure of, especially where the casinos are, is not served by jaywalking. And because it is really imperative to maintain that influx of people in these very specific streets and ways, and the number of cars that go through, they hyper police for jaywalking, and therefore most people don't jaywalk in Las Vegas. It is so long to get from one place to another. The streets are packed. You'd think it would be easy because it is to jaywalk at any of those like non-intersections, but they absolutely police for it. They do it regularly. It is consistent, and it is a very, very, very high fee. So it's not the criminalization which changes people's behavior because it's criminalized in both places. It's the policing practices. And so under asymmetrical criminalization, policing is not removed, but it does shift. And often, and what happened in these 5 countries was that it actually, for the most part, increased. The only place that it didn't super increase was Northern Ireland. But the other thing that changed was people's perception of the law. So all of a sudden, buyers felt criminalized where they had not before. And they could say, I'm afraid of a sting operation. I'm afraid of a charge. And so sex workers have to cater to that fear to be able to meet that client. Clients also, just like sex workers, avoid criminalization. And so they're not going to go to places which are hyper-policed. And so if you have a sting operation that's on a website and it's super public, clients leave that website. If you have a sting operation and it's super public and it's on a number of websites, clients don't feel comfortable sharing information. And so where previously sex workers could say, I want your legal name, I want X, I want Y, I want Z, clients were saying no. And so the inability to screen clients to check their names against bad date lists was something that overwhelmingly was reported as something that was no longer possible. In reduced prices, every time it's harder to find clients, your pool of potential clients changes. And so if you are, let's say you do work in a public space, you work on a stroll, and to make as much as you want, you need to see 5 clients and charge $200 per client. If you're on a stroll that is not heavily policed, that's known for sex work, you might have a pool of 10 potential clients that night. And so you can say no to 5 of those clients. You can say no to 5 clients because they appear intoxicated, they seem erratic, you don't like their behavior. You've heard that there's someone who drives a gray car, who has brown hair, and the license plate ends in an X, and that's all you know. So if you see those details, you already know from your friends that that person has been not paying people. So if you have a pool of 10 options and you know you need to see 5, you can say no to 5. If that becomes destabilized, it becomes harder to find clients, and clients have a harder time finding you. And therefore, your client pool might go from an option of 10 to an option of 6. And so you have to make the calculation of who am I going to say no to, or am I not going to say no to anyone? Also, because you're still in an area that probably is frequented by other workers, you might feel that there's increase, or people reported that there's increased competition. And so people, what they do is lower their prices or offer additional services, sex without a condom, other things that they wouldn't necessarily do or don't necessarily like to do. Not that like and work are ever synonymous under capitalism, but people might offer different services depending on what they think is going to get them the client over someone else. The other thing that happened was a destabilization as far as where people were working. When policing increases, people move to different areas, and that includes if you're, and street-based work is the easiest way to do this, but talking about this in digital space is also very true. But people were more likely to be isolated, and anything that would draw attention, like people standing on a street corner together, was going to be avoided. Also, if you work in an area and everyone knows where the stroll is, you're going to go to a different area and you're going to try to work from there. And that means you might know what is you might not know what's well lit. You might not know necessarily where the safest area to go to is to park a car. And so you have to reduce that time that you are trying, or you have to be in an area where you're more likely and more vulnerable to experiencing victimization.
And Kate,
the other thing that happens under,
oh, sorry. And Kate, you know, I can't, obviously I'm thinking about my clients who are experiencing trafficking. And these are individuals who have to make a certain amount of money per night or else face violence at the hands of their trafficker. And these are things that, you know, not just people who trade sex out of circumstance or choice are facing. These are conditions and challenges that trafficking survivors are facing because of their need to make a certain amount of money in order to be able to pay a trafficker. So these are challenges that trafficking survivors are navigating as well.
Yeah, I think I always forget that because it feels really intuitive. When you change the dynamics and you make sex work more, people who engage in sex work or the sex trade more vulnerable, that includes people who are in trafficking situations. So all of this is still true if you're in a trafficking situation as well. And you know, you can say, all right, I used to make $1,000 a night, but I can get by on $700 a night. Your trafficker isn't going to say that. And so you're going to face more of those challenges. Your trafficker isn't going to be like, well, the market's really tough. Guess I'll be nicer now. So under decriminalization, working conditions kind of shifted as well. As I've already mentioned, there were shifts in location for workers who were seeking management. So a lot of people moved indoors when they were street-based before. Also 2003, people had the internet. 64% reported an increased ability to refuse a client. So one of the dynamics that shifts is that the power dynamics around negotiation, around what that does. If you are less likely to say no to a client, the power you have in any negotiation drops dramatically. So 64% reported that they were more likely after this law was passed to refuse a client that they did not want. That was higher for people who were indoors versus street-based. Street-based workers generally experience a higher risk and a higher level of vulnerability overall. Also, they were able, in a non-criminalized space, they were able to access workplace protections, including things like sexual harassment. A lot of people don't realize that you actually can understand and identify what sexual harassment is when you work in the adult industry. Strippers do it all the time. There's a very significant difference to intimate labor and sexual harassment. Sex workers know it very well. And so one of the other things that changed was sex workers were able to access labor protections, including sexual harassment, including online harassment protections, such as doxing. There was a case last year that was actually settled because someone was being harassed online for being a sex worker. And were able to bring that case forward, felt comfortable, and felt comfortable doing so, which I think is a really important piece.
Kate, we have a question that I'd love to take a minute to answer. The question was, why weren't these challenges as prevalent when the whole transaction was criminalized, as opposed to the asymmetrical criminalization that happened and these changes were noted? Weren't buyers at risk in both situations?
Sure. No, and that's a phenomenal question. I really appreciate that. In Canada, so there's a range of what happened in terms of either maintenance of policing or increases in policing after these laws were passed. In a number of countries, Sweden, Norway, France, there were increases in policing budgets, really specifically going after buyers. So there was an increased police presence for the sex trade. And that had some of the most significant impacts. When you are increasingly policing a trade, people are experiencing policing in these different ways. Even when you don't increase policing, if you shift policing to hyper target buyers, all of a sudden buyers have a lot more fear. So under current law, sex workers experience more fear of criminalization than buyers for a variety of different reasons. Sex workers are more likely to be experiencing different forms of criminalization and marginalization than buyers of sexual services. So even if you, and this happens frequently where something will happen, both people will get charged. Sex workers are more likely to be leading lives that have additional vulnerabilities to different forms of criminalization just overall. Just the positionality of those two people is different. So a lot of times sex workers have a lot more negotiating power, even just because of that. And so when things change to say, all right, we're going to prosecute buyers, and very often we're going to do this incredibly publicly. So when you see sting operations that all of a sudden have 15 photos with names of people who are charged with purchasing sexual services, that is meant to have an impact, and it does. It does not stop people from buying sex, but it means they're more scared when they do. And so when you have something where a buyer is not necessarily as clued into the criminalization they face, but a sex worker is, especially because sex workers are, most people don't see like 3 sex workers a night, but sex workers probably see multiple clients a day. So you're engaging more. Every time you engage, you think about criminalization, you think about policing. When you engage with a sex worker, you're less likely to do that. And so because of just the dynamics of thinking about policing is shifts to where all of a sudden buyers have a lot more fear, you have to engage in a way that makes the buyer feel comfortable, or else they're going to go and find someone else who will do that. And so when there is a big public sting operation and you get contacted by someone and you say, all right, I need your screening information so that I could double check it against a bad date list, so I can see who you are, so I can make sure you're not a cop. That if that person does not feel afraid of law enforcement or afraid of the repercussions of that, they'll give you that information really freely. If you know you're not talking to law enforcement, and you can freely negotiate things like boundaries, you can freely negotiate what services are going to be provided. If your client will not do that, if your client is afraid, your entire job becomes making them comfortable, and their demands become paramount to yours. And so when they say, I don't want to talk about this, I want you to come to my house because I know they do stings out of hotels, those are just different ways that you have to give up power to make them more comfortable. And so that's why they saw these kind of things, because your entire job becomes making that person feel more comfortable. And usually that's preserving their anonymity. I hope that answered it. If you have follow-up questions or if that doesn't make sense, totally feel free to ask more.
So Kate, it sounds like what you're saying, just to make sure that Hannah's question was answered, that under criminalization model, buyers quite often did not face any criminal penalties, and the criminalization fell almost entirely on the person who was selling sex. And then under asymmetrical criminalization, the criminalization in theory switches to the buyers, which then impacts the power differential in their attempts to not be criminalized for buying sex. Okay.
Yeah, and also, you know, sex workers are just thinking about criminalization and policing on a pretty constant basis, and buyers generally are not. So even in a country where both parties are criminalized, if you have someone who's just constantly thinking about that in the background and kind of designs their life to avoid it, and someone who doesn't, that first instance, or like, if they only see a sex worker like once every 6 months, that's probably the only time that that might be the only time that they are like, I'm engaging in a criminal activity that is policed. I don't know how to navigate this. And so their fears become outsized. Maybe they're not outsized, but their fears become a really dominant part of the conversation. And so it's a lot about policing, but also just the mental impact that that has to engage in a criminalized activity regularly versus irregularly. This one's super important. Access to health service professionals, which was really broadly defined in all of these different countries. So under asymmetrical criminalization of the countries that reported on this, in Canada, almost half saw a decrease in access to health services, and a quarter saw a decrease in access to community-based public health services even. In Sweden, there were no increased requests for services, as well as cutting funding for harm reduction services. I think it's really important to remember that harm reduction services are actually conceptually incompatible with end demand. If you want to abolish the sex industry, you can't engage in harm reduction to make it safer for people in the sex industry. And so what they did was actually cut the funding for any health service, any harm reduction services, including HIV. They were no longer doing condom distribution, that kind of stuff, and everything shifted to exit-based models. In Northern Ireland,
that seems totally counterintuitive. That seems totally counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was that a trend, Kate, that you saw, like that shift, that shift in funding across, you know, many of these different countries' experiences?
Yes and no. And I think, I don't know if anyone is from harm reduction service provision on here, but part of it is also just how much the government is willing to fund harm reduction services already. Yeah, depending on where that funding was coming from and the ways that NGOs access that funding, you know, does your Department of Health do harm reduction outreach services, or do they offer grants and not ask a lot of questions to a community organization? So those are all kind of some of the similar nuances, but in no area do they like create or expand harm reduction services. And in certain places they were actually cut. In Northern Ireland, there were...
Sorry, just a shameless plug. If anyone is interested in how you can incorporate harm reduction practices into your anti-trafficking work, that was not our last webinar, but the webinar before that. We talked with some harm reduction experts from Baltimore City. And if you want to listen into that presentation, you can on the MVLS website.
Yes, BHRC is amazing. I recommend everyone reach out to them, and they do amazing services that actually do serve folks that trade sex and folks that use substances, which is a little more rare than we want it to be in harm reduction service provision. And also, harm reduction is where a lot of folks who are experiencing trafficking, especially in non-traditional forms of labor, go and disclose a lot more information. So partnerships with harm reduction services that honor the challenges that they have are like, that is my heart. And then France, just rounding out 4 of the 5 Norway did not talk a lot about harm reduction service provision. France had, they expanded exit-only service provision. Actually, in Sweden and France, it is the first section of the bill to expand, to fully fund them, fully. And in France, half of the folks that they spoke to had not even heard of the exit programming. And of the program, there was one in particular that they spoke to who said that they had done outreach to 600 different people. And they said, off the record, we think maybe 10 applications have ever come in. Under decriminalization, and just to note, New Zealand has socialized medicine. So that also is a different dynamic when we're talking about this that has to be considered. They saw no significant change in access to harm reduction services, and the vast majority of workers had independent doctors already, and half of them had disclosed their profession to their health service provider. And then just in addition, and going back to kind of regulations, under this law, condom use is actually mandatory, and they generally didn't really speak to sex workers who had engaged in condomless sex with clients. And when I say mandatory, it doesn't face criminal penalty. There's a $2,000 fine. And so sex workers said when they would get requests for condomless sex from clients, they would just say fine, but the upcharge is $2,500 just in case you're a cop. Relationships with law enforcement. And I think this is so important when we're talking about people who are being victimized and experiencing victimization, and what access to law enforcement, what reaching out means. Under asymmetrical criminalization, overwhelmingly, one of the most regularly reported things in countries was that sex workers reported that because they felt surveilled and harassed by police and were being surveilled and harassed by police, there was no reported improvement. And in almost every single country, those conditions deteriorated. Because many of these countries incorporated, if you're going to do a sting operation, if you're going to look for buyers, you're going to look for sex workers, and you're going to trail sex workers to find buyers. That's just the way that the policing mechanism worked. And so sex workers said, I'm constantly being surveilled, I'm constantly being harassed. 31% reported that they would not call 911 for help if they were experiencing victimization. In other countries, they said the level of violence that I would have to experience before I called 911 is so much higher now. A lot of places, sex workers were reporting to each other experiences of violence, but no one was reporting to police. Under decriminalization, and this is also something that I think is incredibly important to, regardless of how you feel, NZPC, the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, is a decades-old sex workers union. The other thing about New Zealand is it's real tiny. So they have one union for the entire industry. And so you have an organizing body, you have a collective organizing body that can negotiate. And this organization had begun 10 years before, in the early 90s, developing this advocacy effort, but incorporating law enforcement in those efforts. And that was relationship building. That was a relationship and trust building process that went on a decade before decriminalization happened. When the law shifted, sex workers continued to prefer reporting to peers, specifically NZPC, when they did experience violence. They still wanted to maintain those relationships. And so there just wasn't that much of a change in how many people reported, because they said what they feared was not arrest as to why they didn't go to report this, but it was actually stigma, and it was fear of outing. So a lot of people were just afraid of how they were going to be perceived by law enforcement. And more importantly, they didn't want it to go public with legal name. And so when we say, what is a safe place to report, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And for folks before and after the law, there were not necessarily changes in that, and the fears just remained outside of policy change. But there was incredibly few reports of adverse experiences with law enforcement, including harassment, but there just weren't reports happening at that point of police violence against sex workers. And I really do think that, spending 10 years creating those relationships and sensitizing people and making that a safer environment to report violence, that was just something that they had been doing, and doesn't have to include policy change.
Kate, just a quick question. You mentioned the issue of, being outed as someone who trades sex. Is that kind of to bring us back to your slide around legalization, I know you touched on it and you said that no one's really advocating for it. And does that have a lot to do with the fact that someone would have to register in some way or out themselves as someone who's trade sex? And even if I'm not risking criminalization, I'm still risking stigmatization and discrimination.
That can be one of the reasons. There's a lot of reasons why people don't advocate for legalization. It's a really management focused model. And that's a lot of the reason why, like, it just doesn't allow people to operate, and legalization re-marginalizes the most marginalized people in the sex trade, and sex worker advocates are about collective liberation. One of those is registration, and in not necessarily in Maryland, but there's actually a lot of states around the country that engage in a legalization model around strippers and dancers, and the porn industry is actually one that we could look at as a legalization model. And there've been a number of problems with what happens when you have to register and have to get a license. At one point I was doing some advocacy, and I was curious about Atlanta, where you have to register. It's about $500 to get a license. It's a non-transferable license, so if you have a problem at one club, you have to pay another $500 to work at a different club. And I called and I wanted to know. And so I put on a very nice voice. And I said, I really want to be a dancer. I'm moving from out of state. What do I have to give? And the woman told me the list of information, and it included my home address, my legal name, a range of different things. And I said, okay, well, if I'm giving this to you, I am trying to get away from my super abusive. He's kind of a stalker. I really just need to get away. And he knows how to access government records. If he puts in a public Freedom of Information Act request, can he get this information? And she was like, I will be right back. That is a great question. And she went and she came back and she said, sweetheart, I am sorry, he will. And so having that kind of information, putting that out in a way where people fear outing, especially if it is a DV situation, if you are going through a custody battle, people are not going to do that, and that is going to be a massive impediment to coming forward if there's any chance that people's public names and this comes out.
Yeah, so we're back to safety again. Not just discrimination, we're back to safety.
So this is the big one. What is the impact on client violence when we change this? And the impact across 5 different countries who have implemented asymmetrical criminalization was incredibly clear. In Northern Ireland, the number of assaults quadrupled between 2016 and 2018. And they actually, it's also a small country, so they maintain a single bad date list. And actually, it's kind of amazing. The police, they take out of their police budget, they fund an independent private sex worker group to maintain a national bad date list, because they say, we don't need that information as much as sex workers do, and we know the impact that this has on safety for folks that trade sex. So the police actually partially fund that. And they saw assaults quadruple. They saw a doubling in violence in the very first year of implementation. In France, different NGOs reported either increases in frequency of victimization or severity of victimization, depending on the organization that they spoke to. In Norway, because the policing in Norway was very, very racialized, they were very straightforward about that. When you talk to law enforcement there, it skyrocketed for racialized workers, and it actually slightly decreased for Norwegian workers. So people began targeting specifically women of color and migrants to enact violence, knowing that Norwegian workers were safer. In Canada, similarly, racialized workers reported increases in violence, where there were not the same increases for specifically white workers or for domestically born sex workers. So it's incredibly consistent to what folks saw. Under decriminalization in New Zealand, there were not significant changes in the levels of violence. Those are also lower levels than I've seen in every other country, including when I've worked here. And so there just weren't huge changes under decriminalization. People were more likely to refuse a client that they thought they did not want to see. They were less likely to experience other forms of harassment. They were more likely to choose management and leave management when they wanted. And so the changes in just overt violence stayed pretty low. But again, they preferred reporting to peers and not law enforcement. So how does criminalization affect rates of violence? Because this is really important, and I feel like this should be the crux of a lot of our conversations, is what are our criminalization policing practices doing to the safety of the impacted community, and that's folks trading sex. Criminalization turns a population into a target population, unfortunately. And so, when we're talking about all of these other impacts, when you're talking about folks that experience economic insecurity, who are more likely to be in vulnerable situations, who are now less likely to report anything to police, who are now less likely to screen clients, criminalization and policing really cuts off harm reduction techniques, and it really compromises the ability of sex workers to stay safe. And that includes people who are engaged in trafficking situations. Your trafficker does not care if you cannot screen clients anymore. So I think that if nothing else, continued policing and criminalization is really setting people up to be targets for victimization. And of course, impact on trafficking, that is the big question. So here's the data. There's no country that has implemented asymmetrical criminalization that has reported a single change in trafficking, either an increase or a decrease. You can try, there is one country that Sweden tried to economically model rates of trafficking before this change, but also before there was a trafficking law and then after a trafficking law, and then model that against comparative analysis of other countries. And they were like, we think that compared to other countries, compared to this new definition, within 3 years, we think there would have been more trafficking had we not implemented the law. And that's the closest any country has been able to come to saying that there is a change. But the Swedish police actually don't even agree with that report. But of the other countries that have implemented it, there is absolutely no change that has been reported. And you can look at, and those are from departments of justice.
And we think it's not data, correct? I mean, unfortunately, that's how a lot of misinformation about trafficking gets spread. It's that this is what we have seen, or this is what we think. What we think is not data.
Yeah, because even if you look at how the Swedish police described it, they were basically saying, like, we were prosecuting this as kidnapping, now we're prosecuting it as trafficking. And even their economic modeling was very based on comparative modeling from migrant influxes into other countries. You would not place a bet if you received that same information. But of the countries that had information about trafficking before and after, and had trafficking laws in place before and after, none of them have reported any change. Similarly, decriminalization, New Zealand did not report massive changes in rates of trafficking, either increases or decreases. Again, it's a small country, and it was 2003, but they have not necessarily seen changes in anything that would point them to make that assumption, similar to other countries. So decriminalization of the sex trade has not in any instance, or changes in criminalization of the sex trade in any single country has shown anything that we can point to show an impact on specifically rates of trafficking.
So Kate, I don't know if you can necessarily, and this might actually go into the research challenges for this question. I'm not sure if you can necessarily speak on this. In terms of individuals that I've heard that, that really disfavor decriminalization, one of the things that we hear the most is decriminalization increases trafficking, no ifs, ands, or buts. So where are folks getting this information? How, okay. that was a shrug. I don't know if you can answer that necessarily. Are there studies that are saying this that you find, questionable data-wise? Or are these research challenges?
I haven't found a single study that actually says it.
I'm sorry?
I mean, I think anyone that unequivocally says it will do it, that has never been shown, that has never been demonstrated. It definitely didn't happen in New Zealand. It definitely didn't happen in Australia. And the changes haven't borne out in any of the countries that have changed their legal regimes in the last 22 years. So it's just not necessarily something that we can point to. And there are research challenges. You know, the other thing that's happened in the last 22 years was that we got a trafficking law. And especially when we're looking, and it was a trafficking law that is really difficult now sometimes to understand, and to understand where it's been implemented and where it hasn't been implemented. And so when we're talking about this kind of stuff, there's a range of things that impact these numbers. You have to, if you're going to say that this policy change is going to do this, you have to do robust reporting and robust research before and after that happens. And you have to be correctly identifying people before and after that happens. So how much research was your country doing on the sex industry before this was implemented versus after it was implemented? In a place like Canada, a huge amount. France had outreach to sex workers. Northern Ireland had an incredible amount of information because sex workers have been organizing. So there was information about changes before and after the change. In New Zealand, they had done a really robust study in 1999, which actually catalyzed the change in the law. And so they had something when they were doing research in 2006 and 2008, they had comparative samples that were very similar. So that's one of the challenges of this question. And over the last 22 years, we've been trying to figure out, how do we quantify trafficking? In 2006, the Government Accountability Office, the US Government Accountability Office, said there's no trafficking information that we find reliable because every country is utilizing this term completely differently. And so saying anything happened around the passage of a 1999 law regarding trafficking is not super helpful because we don't even have a consistent definition 7 years later. So there's a lot of research challenges really specific to this question. Certain things are a lot easier to look at before and after. You can talk to people about, you know, how do you feel now? Have things shifted for you? Trafficking, unless you're doing the same kind of robust research into trafficking and doing that afterwards, most countries aren't doing that, and most countries were not doing that 10 years ago. And so there's a lot of challenges when it comes to really understanding and looking at this. But there are things we can look to. We know that trafficking isn't like random and it didn't get invented in 2000. So we can look at things like rates of vulnerability, can look at rates of violence, and we can understand the dynamics of trafficking. We do understand the dynamics of trafficking and look at how those changes have happened, look at, you know, the life conditions of people in an industry. And we can look at those things. But the question of like, what is the impact of decriminalization on trafficking? It's tough. What is the impact of asymmetrical criminalization on trafficking? Thus far, there hasn't been any.
Kate, we had a question going back to the rates of violence and the change in that. We had a question about some kind of specific aspects of that. The individuals was wondering if it was true that where it's legalized, for example, in Germany, that the rates of homicide against sex workers is significantly higher, which is actually something I feel like I've read in like articles as well, like I think is, you know, I'm curious to hear your answer about what the data actually says.
If you look at globalized, like if you look at legalized countries, if you look at criminalized countries overall, if you look at New Zealand, and kind of do comparative models, rates of homicide against sex workers are not necessarily higher in legalized countries versus criminalized countries. You're also looking at a huge range of different dynamics in countries. And so, you know, comparing female homicide rates in Mexico versus the Netherlands are also kind of incomparable. And so pulling that out for kind of a globalized understanding of generally female homicides, it's a little tricky. And one of the other things is in criminalized countries, whether or not that person trades sex is going to be a lot harder to identify versus in legalized countries where people have to register. So you're also talking about like female homicides in a country where people are criminalized, are not allowed to disclose sex work versus a country where people have to literally register with the government that they are sex workers. And so as far as looking at, and there was something put out by, I believe it was UN AIDS, that looked at legal regimes and rates of violence, and criminalization. Fully criminalized countries have higher levels of violence against people engaged in the sex trade than they do in any other legal regime. And so we've talked about a range of things. And I think it's really important when we're talking, yes, we're here, we've spent an hour and 10 minutes talking about legal regimes, and now I'm going to be like, but there's other things too. But it's also really important to recognize, and especially for groups of folks who are, you're not a policy body necessarily or at your core. Not everyone on here even has funding that would allow them, people have lobbying restrictions. So it's really important in this conversation that, we do have to talk about laws, and we actually have to talk about the things beyond laws and the things that contribute to the health and safety of people engaged in commercial sex. And there's a lot of things that are significantly more impactful to changes in law, or right up there, and really important to remember. And so regulatory policy doesn't cover a lot of things. First and foremost, it does not, or regulatory policy about criminalization of the sex trade, it impacts every single one of these things, but it is not every single one of these things. So none of this is going to address the root causes of vulnerability outside of the barriers of a criminal record, kind of on its face. And so what was still true in every single one of these countries was that sex workers were looking for access to resources. Folks were looking for housing. Not everywhere were they looking for healthcare anymore. People wanted parental support. For folks who were trying to exit the industry, one of the barriers was that there still wasn't living wage jobs, and not living wage jobs that they could immediately go to. One of the major problems of exit-only services is similar to other abstinence-only models, switching from A to B and being like, you're not even going to give me a living wage stipend? Not an option for like the vast majority of people. The biggest complaint of in France that came out from exit services was, I need to scale down. I can't just stop working and hope to find a job and keep applying and trying to figure my life out while I have zero income. So living wage jobs remain a significant problem, even for folks that do want to leave the industry. Access to education. Expansion of services was included in some of the models, but reduction of services was actually the biggest response to asymmetrical criminalization. And I was actually at a hearing this week that was all about criminalization, and every single person who was promoting the bill was talking about the need for services. Services aren't policing, and harm reduction models are really incompatible with asymmetrical criminalization. And if we know anything about engaging with people with vulnerability and a range of experiences, you have to meet folks where they are and not leave them there. You have to give someone something at the place where they're at, and you can't give them something that will only work if they meet a certain set of criteria that isn't resonant in their lives. It doesn't provide criminal record relief. Sometimes these bills do, but sometimes they are only looking forward. And we really need to understand the impact that criminal records, yes, for prostitution, but also for trespassing, loitering, weapons, and trafficking, frankly, carry, and what that does to really force people to stay in precarious situations. And it doesn't do prevention, and it doesn't do worker engagement, which, that's basic outreach. And under, sex workers know their rights are being violated when we are really, really clear that sex workers have rights. And so doing that kind of engagement, letting people know that there are options, and that, there is everyone has access to certain basic human rights, and people are able to find spaces outside of that. These laws don't do that. And so we need to engage more with the places that do that, because no one can identify human trafficking if they genuinely believe that they're signing up for violence. So with the last couple minutes, feel free to put questions in the Q&A, feel free to put questions in the chat, and I will toss it back to the moderators about how y'all wanna.
Yeah, if anyone has a comment they'd like to share and would like to speak, you could also raise your hand and we could unmute you so you could ask your question, but otherwise we're happy to just keep an eye on the Q&A, keep an eye on the chat. And I do just want to say a huge thank you, Kate. That was a really enlightening presentation and discussion about the nuances of all these different approaches. And really, again, what we'd hope to do is look at what the data is actually telling us so that we can speak from a place of knowledge as opposed to just a place of assumption about how these different frameworks can impact people. So yeah, thank you so much.
And even if you don't have a question, because we've had some questions kind of come up. If no one has questions, I would love to hear something that resonated with you. Like what was one takeaway you got from this presentation? I mean, and I'll go first. It kind of goes, I don't remember which slide, but just, my question about when people say absolutely decriminalization increases trafficking. For me, that's kind of validation of what I've kind of talked about throughout my work in this industry, is that, a knee-jerk response to something is usually not the way to go. And that when anyone gives you a simple answer to anything regarding trafficking, regarding complex human relationships, about complex human needs, they're probably not right because it's always more complicated than that. And so that was really what I heard, is that, there's material in there that I didn't expect to see because of my own biases and things that I believe about these legal schemes. So just want to thank you for kind of kicking me in the butt around that. Does anyone have anything that resonated with them that they'd like to share? Or is everyone starving?
I can say something that resonated with me. I mean, there was so much that resonated with me with this presentation. Just, particularly looking at impact on safety and impact on, people's experiences with violence, and how, that targeted approach of asymmetrical criminalization, really led to an increase in violence that individuals were experiencing. That was one thing. And the other thing too, Jess and I always try to have a racial equity lens when we're doing the work that we're doing. And like, I didn't know that fact about the law in Norway and how it was, being enforcement or non-enforcement of, the framework they implemented there was being enforced by law enforcement based on citizenship status, and how racialized it was. And it just got me thinking too about, how racialized policing can be here in the United States, here in Maryland, here in Baltimore City. We can drill down on that more, and I hope we will in future, webinars. But there's layers and layers that I think we didn't even begin to unpack in this webinar about how criminalization can impact people and can make them less safe. And I was curious, Kate, if there was any breakdown in any of the data that you saw about some of the individuals reporting about their demographics, besides that example you gave of the enforcement model that was happening in Norway.
Yeah, and part of it, part of this conversation that doesn't necessarily get talked about that much, but there's a report out of Canada that really breaks it down. And I think especially because we're talking very oftentimes about Northern European countries, the impact was overwhelming in almost every single country for migrants. And even in New Zealand, the people who continue to face higher rates of violence, higher rates of targeting, the lowest rates of reporting to law enforcement was always migrant populations. In Canada, it's the exact same thing. And it's because, when we talk about disparate charges, like, yes, you might be surveilled and you might get picked up on a trespassing charge, and your client gets a patronizing charge, and that's rough, and you spend a night. And the people who are making the biggest, who are prioritizing non-contact with police over health and safety across the board were migrants, because the downside is deportation. And
right,
so
it's just another layer of oppressive policies, just another layer of danger, and just another layer of criminalization. And so there's even more that has to be done within, even if you believe that one model is better than the other.
Yeah, and honestly, it's so stark. It was so stark in New Zealand that about 3 years ago, the country announced that they were revisiting the policy because the rates of just all negative impacts were still higher and remained unchanged for migrant sex workers. And so they're actually looking to incorporate migrant sex workers into their law to make sure that they are not facing those. But whether we're talking about Canada, whether we're talking about definitely Norway, definitely Sweden, the impact was felt most significantly among migrants, and in those countries, racialized migrants, really specifically Asian and African women.
Kate, we have a question from an attorney who works with both sex workers engaging by choice or necessity and sex trafficking survivors. And they're wondering how we can engage with both sides in a productive conversation about decrim. They noted, I felt in my experience, the two spaces don't engage and are often pitted against one another. And how, do you have any recommendations for approaches to really be able to work together to find a solution that would, again, I think we all have in mind just increasing the safety of everyone?
Yeah. No, I think that's the right question. Survivors are not a monolith, and folks who experience violence in the sex trades feel a lot of different ways. And that includes feelings about police, feelings about criminalization, feelings about criminalization of different parties. And that is true for a range of experiences. I'll never forget, I was organizing some folks in one city, and the big problem that they wanted to talk about was sexual violence from law enforcement. And we had two camps, and these were not the typical like sex trafficking survivors over here want to criminalize clients. It was not that conversation at all. Everyone in the room was a very low income sex worker, predominantly street-based, who experienced incredible levels of violence, and were in community together. And the big rift was, one group was like, I'm not going to say what I was about to say. One group was like, I don't want to deal with police. I want alternative reporting. I want that. And the other side said, no, I want sensitive police officers. And I'll never forget, someone said, I just want them to be as nice to me when I report violence as they are to me when they're my clients. And that was the divide. And even survivors in community with each other said it had a variety of different reactions to their experience and needed something. I don't have a perfect answer to this, but here's what I do know. I feel like finding common ground is something that is often stolen from people who trade sex. I feel like two different options are always offered, and it looks like the binary. There's the decriminalization side over here, and then there's the more policing and therefore more services over here. And it means that, and when more policing means that this other side of the conversation is going to face harm and violence, that pits people against each other, because both of them are saying my survival depends on you not winning. And that is harmful, and it's also a false construct. And so I definitely, every time I've sat in a room with people who feel things across the spectrum, and sometimes it is very, very difficult. These are very hard conversations to have, and they're emotionally draining, and they're really painful sometimes. When I sit in a conversation, I have to smile and be nice, and then I have to see that person's name, sign a letter to say more policing in the city where I organize here. Especially when they're not from here, and you're like, you really want to give BPD more power? Okay, that's hard. But what we do every single time we do it is say, the most important thing right now, if I can get additional funding for outreach, if I can get additional funding for housing, if I can lower barriers, that has nothing to do with cops. That has everything to do with all of these other things. And you know what? Cops removing criminal penalties, changing policing, that is a long conversation, especially in a place like Maryland. And people would vilify me for saying this, but I don't think Maryland's getting decrim anytime soon. But there's so much that we can do in the meantime, and those places are so fertile. And engaging collective healing, I think, is really important. And collective healing can only happen in a place where people are stable and secure. And so if you are threatening people's stability and security, that means they will never reach healing. And that is true on both sides. If you feel like I am taking away because I want to remove criminalization. If I am creating instability in your life, if I am creating fear in your life, if I'm cutting off the way that you found access to basic resources, then you are always going to push back against me. If we can come from a place that says, you know what, you shouldn't have been trafficked, and you shouldn't have been trafficked before you got access to a bed. So what if we dealt with that? And what if we sat here and said the only things that we're going to talk about are lifting the floor for all of us? Then by the time we get to that conversation on criminalization, then we'll at least have these productive conversations, and maybe a little bit more trust, and maybe a little bit more faith in each other, and maybe a little bit of shared humanity that will make this conversation, this very painful conversation, at least a little bit easier. And I know it's not perfect. I know it's not easy. It's the only place where I've found the possibility of coming together is just saying, we don't need cops to heal, and we don't need cops to be housed. But what if we just talked about everyone getting housing, regardless of how you identify?
I know we have to wrap up. There was kind of something related to what you just said resonated with one of our participants. They said the point about policing practices informing conduct more so than law, and how we need to be considering more than just the legal policy we're going to choose. We need to consider that was really enlightening. So I think that that's, that was one of my takeaways as well. So I think that and kind of going along with what you said, taking policing out of the equation and talking about what people need to be able to survive, to be able to thrive, to be able to make choices about what they want with their lives. I mean, I am not someone who is of lived experience, but I want people to be able to make the choices that are right for them. And if someone does not want to trade sex, but finds that that's the only way that they can get their needs met, I don't want that, right? I want people to have access to what they need. And what they need is, or what we need is to eliminate those or address those root causes of vulnerability, because regardless of the legal scheme you choose, right? It doesn't matter. If those things still exist, you are still going to have people who are vulnerable, and you're always going to have someone who can, walk in and snap that person up and exploit that vulnerability. So, the legal scheme is meaningless when it comes down to those base issues of root vulnerability.
Yeah, and I thank you for the time check. If folks have questions or thoughts or want anything, feel free to shoot me an email. And sometimes I tweet a lot. I either avoid Twitter like the plague, or I'm like, we're going to talk a lot today. I try to post a lot about, I have the honor of working with sex worker organizations and anti-trafficking organizations around the country. So I try to do a lot of engagement around policy changes, activism that's happening, specifically in community-led spaces. And then I'm going to let you guys explain this one.
No, just another huge thank you for this presentation, and for jumpstarting a conversation that's been a long time coming, and that we hope to continue. We're actually hoping in the next few months to have another conversation, maybe focusing even closer in on things that are happening here in Maryland, the local level, and discuss what the implementation of some of these models might look like here as well. For now, though, we so appreciate your joining us today. As I'm sure many of you know, the goal of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project is to help reduce some of those collateral consequences of people intersecting with the criminal legal system. And we are trying to engage in as much outreach and provide as many services as we can, including making sure that people can access free legal help to address things like their criminal records, to get civil legal help if they have custody issues, if they have debt, if they have tax concerns. We are here to provide assistance. And you can reach out via our website to make referrals. You can also reach out to try to contact us and to get some of our outreach materials. We'd be happy to mail or drop off things to you at your organization, or if you want to put things out in your local community center, your church, your school, we're happy to provide you with materials. So thank you so much. And then on the next slide, you can see there are ways to follow us on social media. This is particularly for MVLS. We do have a lot of different programming that's available. We have been trying to keep up with updates related to the health crisis, to the COVID epidemic, to legal concerns that are arising out of that. So please stay tuned to our Facebook and to our Twitter account. And you can also find upcoming trainings available on our events page. I hope you'll join us for some of that. Otherwise, if you're interested in learning more about the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, and then the last slide, we have Jess and I's contact information, and you can always feel free to reach out there. We will be sending around a PowerPoint of the presentation slides, as well as, and we will be posting a fact sheet with some of the, I think, the most relevant points that we gleaned from this awesome discussion on our website in the future. And as Jess already put in the chat, there is a resource library on our website where you can access all of our past recordings, and hopefully this one will be up in a week or two. So thank you so much for joining us today. Jess, any closing words?
Nope, believe it or not. Just Kate, I cannot thank you enough for this presentation, and just for always supporting the work that we do. And Heather, thanks for being my main partner in crime on these things.
And with that, we will wrap, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you next quarter for our next presentation. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for the work that you do.
Thank you.